Hi, it is February 4th. I'm Daniel Estrada. This is Engineering Ethics at NJIT. We're on lesson 4. Let's go ahead and jump into the lesson. Yeah, here we go. We're on lesson 4. Remember last week we introduced the Pinto case. We talked about consequentialism, the trolley problem. A lot of you wrote your essays on that. This week we're going to be diving deeper into the Pinto case. We're going to be looking at Dennis Gioia and his article, Pinto Fires and Personal Ethics. Dennis Gioia was the field recall coordinator at Ford during the Pinto controversy. He wasn't the one responsible for designing the vehicle or releasing it, but he was the one who was responsible for issuing a recall once they had known there was a problem. He declined to do that, and in the article he explains why. He says, I remain convinced that I had made the right decision in not recommending the recall of the cars. In light of the times and the evidence available, I thought I had pursued a reasonable course of action. More recently, however, I've come to think that I really should have done everything I could have to stop those cars, to get those cars off the road. So we'll look at Gioia's decision at the time, why he changed his mind. That's the core of this class. Gioia explains his decision in terms of what psychologists call script schemas. We'll also think a little bit about scripts. We'll talk a little bit about the challenges of conflicts in the workplace, how to handle conflicts in the workplace. I have some suggestions from your textbook about how to deal with that. And then we'll close today by thinking about psychology, what Gioia says about psychology, and what this really says about human decision making, especially in groups, in the context of peer pressure, in the context of pressure from an authority, how this changes people's minds, and the implications it has for doing the right thing, for ethics. Good. So remember, these are the lecture videos, so I'm just going to be introducing the readings. All the readings are online for you to use, and the Hangout on Tuesday, you can come and ask questions, and we can have some discussion on this. Please come to the Hangouts with some discussion, with things you'd like to talk about. It's always more fun when someone else is talking, besides for me. All right. So let me go ahead and go into the Prezi. So here's the Prezi, lesson 4, Dennis Gioia, obedience and conformity. There's Dennis Gioia. He's a field. He was the field recall coordinator at Ford from 72 to 75. Remember, the Pinto gets released in 71, and Mark Dowie's article comes out in 77, I want to say. So he's right there at the center of this Pinto controversy. He doesn't face any legal blowbacks, any legal repercussions, and he wasn't in charge of the decisions going into the Pinto. But he explains his views in his article fairly well. Oh, I should also say that Dennis Gioia is now he works at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a named chair at the University of Pennsylvania Business Management School, where he teaches business ethics to University of Pennsylvania students. So the guy who refused to recall the Ford Pinto now teaches business ethics to all the business ethics students. Isn't that nice? So we'll see how he works. He wrote this article in 1992. This is several decades after the Pinto experience. And in the meantime, he actually goes back to school and studies psychology and ends up publishing academic psychology papers on scripts. So Pinto Fires and Personal Ethics, a script schema analysis of missed opportunities. So he's publishing this in a business ethics journal, but he's talking about the psychology of scripts in 1992. Some of this article is kind of a mea culpa. He's trying to explain why he made the decisions he did, and he's obviously going to try to put himself in the best light possible. So he explains that early on, when he gets into business school, he says, where is it? He says he was very full of himself, quintessential child of the 60s. He was profoundly against the Vietnam War, found a distaste for his distaste for the Vietnam War generated his participation in all sorts of demonstrations, critical of government. He was also critical of business. Typical stance of business seemed to be one of disdain for rather than responsibility towards society. So he was socially aware. He had high principles. He wore his hair long. He was a child of the 60s. Right? So the idea is that he had these high-minded ethics about his own personal views, how much he wanted to stand up to corporate culture. And so when he joined the MBA program and then ended up getting a job at Ford, some of his friends thought he was being hypocritical. But his thought was that I would have a greater chance of influencing the social business if I worked behind the scenes on the inside rather than a strident voice on the outside. He says, besides, I liked cars. So he ends up getting a job at Ford with these high-minded sort of child of the 60s ideals. But he says, predictably enough, very soon he found himself in a tournament-style social environment where he was competing against other MBAs for recognition from the company. The company itself was dynamic, intriguing, the job was challenging, the pay was great. Psychic rewards for working and succeeding in a major corporation proved unexpectedly seductive. I really became involved in the job. Right, so as soon as he joins the job, he ends up getting sucked into the corporate environment. And part of that corporate environment involves this sort of us versus them mentality. Remember we were talking last time about the political environment as the Ford controversy happens, where there's this strong pressure on the industry to make these cheap cars, make them quickly to compete with the foreign market, the import cars. So the American car companies felt like they were under attack from various sides, from these foreign competitors. They were under attack from the media that was helping people like Ralph Nader put up all these regulations and restrictions on the company. So Ford had this sort of us versus them mentality, where us, Ford, needed to defend ourselves against all of them, the outside parties and voices demanding that we change our ways. Right? Even at this time, an intriguing question for me was whether I was us or them. It was becoming apparent that my perspective was changing. I had long since cut my hair. Right? So he admits right off the bat that getting involved with the corporate culture changes his attitudes and especially changes his ethical perspective. Okay. Then he goes through and explains some of what happens with the car, the 2,000 pounds, $2,000, this kind of corporate culture at Ford. We already know all this stuff. Here's the cost-benefit analysis that Ford does. Right? We've seen all of this already. And then he explains his own experience at Ford. He says when he inherited the job, there were 100 active recall campaigns. Right? In addition, there were a number of other safety problems. In addition to these potential recall candidates, there were many files containing many reports. Beyond all these files, he had to construct his own files. So there's a lot of work to do, a lot of things to be concerned with. And he remembers getting files about the Ford Pintos lighting up, which is what the field representatives were saying, in rear-end accidents. He says there were very few reports, perhaps because the component failure was not initially assumed. The cars were simply assumed to be, he says the cars were simply consumed by fire after apparently very low-speed collisions. Was there a problem? Not as far as I was concerned. He says my cue for labeling a case as a problem either required high frequencies of occurrence or directly traceable causes. Right, so there are two criteria. Was there a high frequency of occurrence, or were there directly traceable causes? In these cases, there weren't very many cases of crashes. There didn't seem to be a directly traceable cause. And he says, I had little time for speculative contemplation on potential problems that did not fit the pattern that suggested known courses of action leading to possible recall. He says, I remember feeling disquieted by a field report accompanied by graphic detailed photos of the remains of a burned out Pinto in which several people had died. Although the report became part of my file, I did not flag it as a special case. So he says, even though he felt himself uncomfortable with some of the results of these Ford accidents, he had some rules to follow, right? You don't issue a recall unless high frequency of occurrence or directly traceable causes. Since neither of those happened in these cases, even though he felt himself personally uncomfortable, he didn't make he didn't take steps to issue the recall. And then here's part of the mea culpa. He says, and remember, it's very difficult to keep track of the complexity and pace of the job. So many active potential recall campaigns. He says it remains the busiest, most information job I've ever held or would want to hold. Every case required a myriad of information gathering and execution stages. I distinctly remember that the information processing demands led me to confuse the facts of one problem case with another on several occasions because the telltale signs of recall candidate cases were so similar. I thought of myself a fireman who perfectly fit the description by one of my colleagues. In this office, everything is a crisis. You only have time to put out the big fires and spit on the little ones. By these standards, the Pinto was a distinctly little one. I'm going to keep reading. It's also important to convey the muting of emotion involved in the recall coordinator's job. I remember contemplating the fact that my job literally involved life or death matters. I was sometimes responsible for finding and fixing cars now because someone's life might depend on it. I took it very seriously. Early in the job, I sometimes woke up at night wondering whether I'd covered all my bases. Had I left some unknown person at risk because I had not thought of something? That soon faded, however, and of necessity, the considerations of people's lives became fairly removed, dispassionate process. To do the job well, there was little room for emotion. Allowing it to surface was potentially paralyzing and prevented rational decisions about which cases to recommend for recall. On moral grounds, I knew I could recommend most of the vehicles on my safety tracking list for recall and risk earning the label of a bleeding heart. On practical grounds, however, I recognized that people implicitly accept some risk in their cars. We cannot recall all cars with potential problems and still stay in business. I learned to be responsive to those cases that suggested an immediate dangerous problem. And also the country was in crisis, there was an oil shortage and so on. Right, so look at what Gioia is saying, right? He's saying that he would literally wake up, it would disturb his sleep. He couldn't sleep at night because he was so worried about how important these decisions were. Poor guy, couldn't sleep at night. Right, but as of necessity, he says, because of the corporate culture, because of what's demanded of the job, he ends up muting these emotions. He ends up finding a way to sleep at night, while sort of passing off on all these cases that he knew he had a moral objection to. Right. So he says, on moral grounds, I could recommend recall, but on practical grounds, the demands of the job, right, the culture that the job's operating in, right, the state of the political crisis in the country, the fact that it's his job, right, the fact that he's getting paid for it, right, all of these things make him decide not to issue a recall, even though his morality said that he should. Yeah, so he was sucked into the corporate environment. He was trying to spit on all the problems he could, trying to deal with the big problems when he found them, and according to his script, the Pinto was not a big problem. Actually, let me read a little bit more from this. Yeah, so there's this oil crisis. He does get these reports. Upon seeing one of the reports, he feels sort of disquieted about it. So he, on the basis of this burned out Pinto, he recommends a preliminary department review, right? So he recommends a meeting. Should we issue a recall? After the usual round of discussion, he says, after the usual round of discussion about criteria and justification for recall, everyone voted against recommending recall, including me. It did not fit the pattern of recallable standards. The evidence was not overwhelming that the car was defective in some way. So the case was actually fairly straightforward. It was a good business decision, he says, even if people might be dying. They didn't know then about the high rate of tank failures in normal accidents, right? So they did. So he says here that they didn't have all the crash test information to understand that this was a part failure. That this was a failure they could fix with parts. In other words, it was a defective device. And because he didn't know it was a defective device, it didn't meet the standards for issuing a recall. And so he says there was a unanimous vote against issuing a recall. It didn't meet standards. He says later the existence of the crash test data did become known within Ford, which suggested the Pinto might actually have a recallable problem. The information led to a reconsideration of our case within the office. However, the data, prompted a comparison of Ford's survivability in rear-end accidents with that of other companies' cars. The comparisons revealed that although many cars in the subcompact class suffer from appalling deformation in relatively low-speed collisions, the Pinto was merely the worst of a bad lot. Furthermore, the gap between the Pinto and the competition was not dramatic in terms of the speed at which the fuel tank rupture was likely to occur. On this basis, it was difficult to justify recall of cars that were comparable with others on the market. In the face of more compelling evidence, even more compelling evidence that people were probably going to die in this car, I again included myself in the group of decision makers who voted not to recommend recall in the highest levels of the organization. Right, so Gioia does call a meeting where they vote unanimously against a recall. Later on, when they actually get the data from the crash test, it looks like it might be a recallable problem. They could issue a recall if it's the scripts, but look, it's not really that much worse than the rest of the subcompact class. Right? The other cars in the same class perform just as badly. And Leah Iacocca says, right, safety doesn't sell. when people are buying these small cars, these economy cars, they're expecting it to not be safe, they're expecting it to be cheap, right? So they are willing to trade that risk for his reasoning for buying this car. In other words, Ford was comfortable with itself releasing this product that they knew was going to kill people. In fact, part of their calculus about whether it would be cost effective to release the product took into account how many people it would kill. And here, Dennis Gioia is explaining his decision in terms of the corporate script that he was supposed to follow. Look, it didn't follow the script. Here's the corporate reasoning. Here's why I went along with it. Yeah, so the issue here that Gioia wants to talk about is the psychology of scripts, is following what people tell you to do, especially what your authorities tell you to do, what a boss tells you to do. Right? It's very hard to go against authority. It's very easy to follow the scripts that you're given, right? The rules that you're told. It's very easy to follow those rules. So that's how Dennis Gioia is going to explain his behavior. I want to come back to this issue of the psychology of obedience in just a little bit. Before I do that, though, I want to refer to some things in the book about sort of the workplace responsibility and rights. Why do people do what they do, especially in a professional workplace environment? There's lots of different explanations for how people behave in the workplace, and the book goes over some of them. Some people explain people's behavior by being selfish and greedy. Right? What motivates people is money. They want money. They're greedy. They want to buy things. They want to do whatever they want, and they'll do whatever it takes to do that. Right? So the explanation here is that people act the way they do because they're selfish and greedy. And that's one explanation. Another explanation that you might give that's somewhat different is that people are obedient, right? People conform to the standards that they're given, even if it goes against their own interests, even if it goes against their own personal values. Right, so here, the explanation is what's right in the corporation is what the guy above you says he wants from you. That's what morality is in the corporation. Right? This is another view. So notice that, first of all, these are different views. Right? Because if you're only acting selfishly, then maybe you won't always do what the company wants. But sometimes people act on behalf of the company, even when it goes against their own interests, even when it goes against their own values. And then how do you explain that if people are just acting selfishly? How do you explain why people conform? Right. So the argument here is that conformist people are willing to follow and do what they're told. There's another option though, and maybe this is the option from David Foster Wallace in the This Is Water video. It's not just that we conform to what people tell us, but it's really that we just don't take the time to think otherwise. Right? Conformity is just the least challenging option. Right? It's the path of least resistance. And so we tend to conform just because it's the easiest. But what's really going on is not just that we're conformists, but that we just don't put any thought into our work in the first place. And so because we're not putting any thought, the easiest thing to do is conform, so that's what we end up doing. And you might think, just to push this a little bit further, you might think that the times when people don't conform are when they're selfish, and maybe that's when they have thoughts, right? So it's the thoughts of selfishness that make them do something other than conformity. Right? So you might see these things as somehow related. Right? So start to think about what motivates people to make the decisions that they do. Right? We've talked about how values enter the workplace, but start thinking about the psychology of acting on values. The book goes through a couple of distinctions that I find a little bit helpful when thinking about these things. These are a little bit technical, but hopefully you find this helpful also. So the book distinguishes between corporate loyalty and what it calls attitude loyalty, or agency loyalty versus attitude loyalty. So there's two. In a corporate culture, in a business, there's often a worry about loyalty. Their business might be doing trade secret stuff that is important to keep secret from competitors, to protect your business, protect the intellectual property or whatever. And so loyalty might be an issue. Loyalty might be a basis on which someone gets hired or which someone is kept on the job. Or failure of loyalty might be a reason someone's fired. So loyalty ends up being a big thing. The book distinguishes between two different kinds of loyalty: agency loyalty and attitude loyalty. Agency loyalty is loyalty to a contract that you've signed on to. So when you become an employee for a company, you have to sign a contract usually, and that contract states the terms of the employment, and you're bound by law when you sign that contract to keep those terms, right? So you have an obligation in this case to maintain the terms of those contracts. And what matters is not how you feel about the contract. You might hate what you have to do because of the contract. You may be there's some clause in the contract that you have to fulfill that you aren't happy about, but because you signed the contract, you have an obligation to do it anyway. Maybe you can sue to break the terms of the contract, but that contract binds you in some way. And so whether or not you like it, you have to fulfill the terms of that contract. So that's a kind of obligation. And again, the point here is that your obligation here is to the contract, to the rules that you've agreed to, and not anything about your attitude. Right? You might not like the terms that you've agreed to, but if you've agreed to them, then you have some obligation of following them. But that's not the kind of loyalty that corporations usually want. It's not just enough to do your job to the letter of the law. What corporations usually want is to cultivate the attitude, a corporate culture, where people are happy to be loyal to the corporations. So as you see this in a lot of like Silicon Valley type jobs, where there's a great benefits package and there's like the playpen in the break room or whatever. And the idea here is not just to make you work there, but to make you really like working there, to make you loyal to the company, not just in terms of following your contract, but in terms of that you actually want to be there, that you're sort of positive, you have a positive identification with the company, you feel good about working with the company. And this is the kind of loyalty that corporations would like to instill in their employees. Maybe it's good. Maybe having employees that have this attitude that they really want to work at the company is a good thing. It helps the company do well. But it's not an obligation in the way that agency loyalty is. Right? Just because you work there doesn't mean you have to like working there. Right? So there's a difference here between agency loyalty and attitude loyalty. When we're talking about loyalty, the obligations you have to the company, it's important to keep these distinct. You don't always have an obligation to identify positively with the company. In fact, sometimes, depending on the job, you might identify very negatively with the company while still staying loyal to the terms of your contract. Right? So make sure those are distinct. And it's also worth distinguishing both of these versions of loyalty with what we might call collegiality. In other words, being respectful of the corporate culture, right? Regardless of your attitude towards it. But respect for the business, respect for your colleagues, respect for the profession, right? Respect for your peers in the profession, respect for your bosses, and so on. Establishing collegiality among employees, connectedness not just to the company as a company, but connectedness to the projects that the company engages in, where there's support within the company. And this is partly how you design a successful company. It's also partly how you instill these positive attitudes in the employees. Part of this discussion is about instilling an ethical corporate culture. We saw with the Ford Pinto that the decisions made about the Pinto, they weren't all being made by Lee Iacocca, but they were strongly influenced by the tone that he set from the top as CEO. Right, so the corporate culture follows the attitudes of the people on top. If the people on top act a certain way, if they have certain values, then the people underneath them tend to replicate and imitate those values. And so you get this sort of cascading effect throughout the corporation based on how the people at top demonstrate their own values. All right, so instilling an ethical corporate culture means not only that all the employees do their job well and act ethically, but also that there's a demonstration of what those ethics look like from the people at the top, from the bosses and the managers, who demonstrate and give a model for how the other employees ought to behave. So not only do the employees behave ethically, but they're given a model for ethical behavior by management, by the people at the top of the hierarchy, and not only that, but that the corporate culture, by that ethical attitude, is sincere in the sense that it's actually applied evenly and fairly throughout the company, that the ethical attitudes are used by the bosses themselves in their own decisions, right? And that the bosses are held to those same standards. Right? Right, so when top management sets a moral tone in words and policies and by their own personal example, this helps create the ethical corporate environment. When ethical language is used and applied honestly and recognized as a legitimate part of the corporate culture, right? So Lee Iacocca says safety doesn't sell. Right? His claim there is that safety is not part of this corporate culture. the vocabulary, the language of safety will not be approved. And Dennis Gioia in his article talks about these kinds of things also, how certain kinds of terms end up being, you end up dancing around them when you're filling out your reports because saying certain things might imply legal implications that the corporation doesn't want to shoulder, right? And so they are very careful with their language in order to dance around these ethical challenges, right? If you're using ethical language in order to avoid ethics, right? This is an ethical problem, right? This is how you build an ethical corporate culture, right? If the top management says one thing and does another, or doesn't hold themselves to the same standard, right? Then no one's going to believe the standards that they're preaching, and the corporate culture goes bad. There also needs to be clear methods for conflict resolution. In the company, there needs to be some procedure to follow if there's a grievance at any level, so that people can register their complaints and have some sense that it actually matters for the way the company's run. If there's no procedures for conflict resolution, or if those procedures look ineffective, then you're going to get a corporate culture that doesn't reinforce itself, right? Doesn't take itself seriously, and this is a problem. So in this light, the book recommends some techniques for managing conflict, not just as a manager, but just when you're in conflict, how do you address the conflict? These are 4 little bullet points taken from page 153 in your book that you might find useful. When there's a conflict, first separate the people from the problem. Make sure that your eyes are squarely on the problem and not the people involved. When you start attacking people, then their egos get involved, they get defensive, they start attacking you back, and that distracts from the problem at hand, right? So even if it's the person that's responsible, or even if it's the person's attitude or personality that's the cause of the conflict, right? Focusing on the person themselves tends to not help alleviate the problems. These are just general rules. These aren't always hard and fast rules, right? These are sort of rules of thumb. Not just focus on problems, but also focus on interests and not just sort of blanket positions, right? So what are the interests of all the people involved, right? What interests do they have in common, right? It's by focusing on those interests that you find the common grounds for resolving whatever problems arise. Generate possibilities. Don't just tell people what to do, but give them options for what to do. Let them choose among those options, right? Allowing people to get involved in the process of resolving conflicts is how you get those resolutions to stick. It's why people come to accept those resolutions, because they see their own part in constructing that resolution. So while you give people possibilities and let them decide, and let them sort of get involved in that process, make sure that the results of these decisions are based on some objective criteria that all the parties involved can agree to, right? This is one of the reasons you want to focus on interests, is to be able to find those criteria that all the parties agree to. If you don't like objective, you might want to change it with the intersubjective, right? Something that is a mutual point of agreement with all the people in the conflict. All right, so that's the closest we're going to get in this class to sort of corporate culture advice. What I want to talk about now is the script schemas that Gioia talks about, and really about the psychology of following. So in psychology, they talk about schemas. A schema is a kind of representation, a cognitive representation, something stored in your brain, that gives you help in deciding what to do. Right? There's lots of things you can do in any given situation. There's lots of different possible ways you can act in a given situation. And you need some way of deciding among all those possibilities what to do. And a schema tells you how to handle situations, or it gives you a script to follow. The best example of a script that we're all familiar with is the script for ordering food at like a fast food place. Right? There's a line for the cashier. You stand in front of the cashier says something like, "Hello, can I take your order?" And then you read off lists items in the menu. You might ask for changes to the menu, but right, the back and forth is pretty set in stone. There's things that you can say. There's things that would be really inappropriate to say. If you start asking the cashier about their personal life, what they do on their free time, if they're free on the weekend, that would get very uncomfortable, because that's off the script, right? That's not what you're supposed to be doing in that situation. I mean, you can ask people out, but when you're ordering food, there's a pattern to that behavior, and everyone knows what that pattern is, and so we can engage in that sequence without any trouble, and we can sort of get what we need to get done, right? We can order the fast food, we can get your food, and get on with our way. We can do that because we share a script, even though you don't know who the other person is, right? I don't know who that person is. I don't know anything about their story. I don't know whether I can trust them or not. But I do know that I can trust the script, right? The script will lead me through this interaction in a way that I know that I can get what I want at the end. So so both people know the script, and it works well enough to get most of the things done that we need to do, right? We have all these scripts around, and the scripts are not only what gets done in what order, but it's also what counts as appropriate and inappropriate behavior in that situation. And when we engage these scripts, when we engage in these social interactions, we're usually following this pattern of behavior. The script for ordering food at a fast food restaurant, the script for interacting with a teacher in their office hours. Right? There's a way this is done, and there's a way that it's not appropriate to do. And when we're engaging in these interactions, we're sort of managing our behavior by trying to stay on script. We get very uncomfortable when we're thrown off script. And this is how Gioia explains his behavior, right? He says, look, there is a script to follow that Ford says this is what the job is. It's my job to do that, right? So I have to follow the script. Right. This script is a sequence of expected behavior, appropriate behaviors for a given situation. And Gioia says, following the script allows him to run on autopilot. Look, there's two criteria for issuing a recall. Does this thing meet these two criteria? Yes, then I'll issue the recall, and there's a procedure for that. If no, then I won't issue a recall, and then we'll move on to the next case. Using this script, Gioia can go through lots and lots of cases, can handle a big caseload. But what it means is that when cases like the Pinto come up that are burning people alive in the cars, Gioia follows the script that says we don't have to do anything about it. And remember, it happens even when he has a moral problem with the issue, right? He looks at these pictures, he feels morally disquieted. He thinks that there's maybe even a moral obligation to stop this car from being on the road. But his script says this is what you don't issue a recall in this case, so he doesn't issue a recall. That's what the job tells him to do. So Gioia, in the article, he says, organizational culture in a very powerful sense amounts to a collection of scripts writ large. Did I sell out? No. Were my cognitive structures altered by salient experience? Without question. Scripts for understanding my action were formed and reformed in a relatively short time in a way that not only altered perceptions of the issue, but also the likely actions associated with those altered perceptions. Right, so I want you to think about scripts. Scripts is the secret word for the day. I want you to think about scripts and how scripts inform our behaviors, how we make decisions about what to do on the basis of scripts. I have a couple of nice little videos from this. I don't think I'm going to show these. You can watch them yourself. This is of the elevator conformity. If you get a bunch of people to stand in an elevator, and then you have some random person, that person will also probably, if they turn around in the elevator, turn facing the back wall. That's not the normal script for operating in elevators, but if you get enough people to do it, it can impose enough social pressure to get other people to turn and face the wall. So this is from an old Candid camera video where they do this. This is a newer version of the same sort of thing. This is this woman is the test subject, and the test subject, so there's a little bell that goes off. I have it muted so you don't hear the bell. But every time the bell goes off, everyone else in the room stands up. She doesn't know why they're doing it at first. She's not told to do it either, right? No one tells her to do this. But if she sees enough people around her doing this, she ends up conforming. Well, because look, that's what everyone else is doing. I guess that's what I'm supposed to do as well. Right, so she conforms. In fact, she does it fairly regularly. And so what they do is they get everyone else to leave the room, get called out of the room, and then they ding the bell again. And the question is, does she stand up? And of course she does. Even though there's no one else in the room to tell her to do that, right? Even though the social pressure has already been removed, she rehearses that pressure again, right? She's already been trained to stand up when the bell goes off, and so she does it herself. Now, you might laugh at her, you might think that this is silly, but every culture, every tradition, every religious belief, every holiday activity, everything that you know to do because of society is learned, is passed on by the same process. This is how This is how culture works. Now, it's absolutely essential that culture works this way, right? That people are able to imitate the others around them and then pass these things on. Right? So whatever tradition, right? Someone did something a long time ago and everyone started doing it. Now we're all doing it because of this social pressure. And interestingly, when you bring new people in, right? So even though she doesn't know what this is about, even though she doesn't know why she's doing it, she sort of passes it along and gets a new group of people to follow that same pattern, and they do, and humanity goes on. So this is social pressure in absence of authority, right? This is just because the people around you are doing it, you end up doing it too. Right? So think about how the social pressure works. In the readings, I talk about the Asch conformity experiment, which is one of the classic cases, 1951, where they have persons not only feel pressure from the group, but they have pressure from the group to do something that they know is incorrect. In this case, it's measuring two lines against each other, which line is the same length as another line, and the people can see for themselves that these two lines are different lengths, but because everyone else says that they're the same length, they say they're the same length also. Right? So not only do they go with the crowd, but they go against their own perception of what's right and wrong. In this case, a fact about what's right and wrong, but it also against what's morally right and wrong. And so I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the Milgram experiment. If you haven't seen it already, the video on the Prezzies, dead. Milgram was a student of Asch in the 1960s. Ran this obedience experiment, so the Milgram obedience experiment. You might have heard this as a sort of shock treatment experiment. No one actually gets shocked in the Milgram obedience experiment. But the idea is to see how willing are people to administer electric shocks, even when they think they're hurting people. So there's three people in this experiment. There's the experimenter, there's the teacher, and there's the learner. The experimenter and the learner are both part of the experiment. They're working with the experiment. They're confederates of the experiment. And the experiment is really testing the teacher. And the question is, for the teacher, how many shocks are they willing to give? Again, no one actually gets shocked. The question is just, will the teacher keep pressing the button to shock someone? The teacher and the learner are told that what's going on here is a memory test. It's a psychology experiment to test someone's memory, and in particular just to test how well learning happens if you're being administered a shock. So the teacher and the learner, again, in this room here, I'll go ahead and show the video. This video is online. On
the other be the learner.
Okay, yeah, so here's the experimenter. This guy on the right is the learner, and he's, remember, a confederate of the experiment, but the experimenter makes it look like it's random. And so here's the teacher, here's the learner, and they draw to see who's who. This is going to be the teacher. He's the actual person that's being experimented. So he's the teacher. And then they show him the shock panel. Up here. So this is the shock panel with these little switches from moderate shock to strong shock to very strong shock at 165 volts, 250 volts, intense shock. I can't read that exactly. It's bad quality. Extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock, and then triple X at 450 volts. So then the learner goes into the other room, and they're hooked to the device. Remember, the learner, as a confederate of the experiment, is not actually going to get shocked. But in the process here, the learner, with the teacher watching, gets hooked up to the device. And the learner also tells the experimenter, hey, look, I just went to the doctor. The doctor said I'm having a heart issue, and it might be a problem. I'm not supposed to do any strenuous activity. So I just want to make sure that this experiment isn't going to affect my heart condition. And the experimenter says, no, you should be fine. Those shocks may be painful, but they won't actually hurt you. It's not going to cause any permanent damage, so you should be fine. And the teacher watches all this happen, and then goes in the other room and is told to start flipping switches for this exam. So the question is, how far do the teachers go in administering these shocks? Now, there's going to be a pre-recorded message from the learner, where the learner is going to start complaining that it hurts, start screaming in pain, start demanding that the experiment stop. And eventually, the experimenter will go silent, as if like they had passed out or maybe have died from a heart attack. And the question is, how much will the teacher continue to administer shocks? So I want to show just a couple of these. first one I want to show is someone who does in fact refuse.
Shock of 75 volts. Oh. Soft hair. He kind of did some yelling in there.
Continue, please.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105 volts. Hard head. Just how far can you go in this thing?
As far as is necessary.
What do you mean, as far as is necessary?
To complete the test. All the words. Please continue.
I sure don't know the effect of this thing, and I'm a little skeptical about electricity.
The experiment requires that you go on, teacher. Please continue.
Incorrect. 150 volts.
Oh.
Sad face.
That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please.
Continue.
My heart's starting to bother me. I refuse to go on. Let me out.
I think we ought to find out what's wrong in there first.
The experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
Well, the experiment might require that we continue, but I still think we should find out what the condition of the gentleman is.
Now, as I said before, although the shocks may be painful, they're not dangerous.
Look, I don't know anything about electricity. I don't profess any knowledge, nor will I go any further until I find out if the guy's okay.
It's absolutely essential that you continue.
Well, essential or not, this program isn't quite that important to me that I should go along doing something that I know nothing about, particularly if it's going to injure someone. I don't know what this is all about.
Well, whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word pairs correctly.
Well, you can sure have your 450 back. I didn't want it anyhow. I intend to give it to some charitable organization, but I wouldn't go on with it.
The 450 is not the issue here. That check is yours simply
Yeah, I
to go
realize
to the
that.
lab. It is essential that you continue the experiment.
No, it isn't essential. Not one bit.
You have no other choice, teacher.
Oh, I have a lot of choices. My number one choice is that I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
Okay, so that guy refused to continue on with the experiment. You heard in the background the experimenter sort of prodding him on. In fact, the experimenter was given a script that they had to follow. If the teacher was objecting to the procedure, then the experimenter was told to give these sort of escalating prods to get them to keep going. So first, please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. And it's absolutely essential that you continue. And then finally, if the teacher keeps refusing, and we heard in this last quote that you have no other choice, you must go on. And in fact, this is what happens, right? So this person refused, says, I don't want to do it until you go check something might be wrong. And the experimenter says, no, you must go on. And this guy says, no, I don't have to. And when it gets to the point where he says, you have no other choice, you must continue, the guy says, well, yes, I have lots of choices. There's lots of things I can do. In fact, this is one of the interesting results of the Milgram experiment, is that if it ever got to the point where you were telling someone that they had no choice, that they must do what you tell them to do, that's exactly when everyone does assert their choice. Right? Telling someone that they have no choice is exactly what makes people realize the choices they have and want to do something different. If you want to control someone, telling them they have no choice is not the way to do it. If it ever got to this point in the experiment, if it ever got to the point where the experimenter was telling them, you have no choice, you must go on, then the experiment would stop. And Milgram, when they were doing this experiment, they polled people to see how many people they thought, or the hypothesis was how many people would go through with the maximum volts. They predicted that only 4% of the subjects would continue through to the highest shock. One-tenth of 1%, yeah, 1/10 of 1% would administer the final shock. In fact, 26 out of 40, so 65% of their original 40 subjects went through with the final shock. The videos that we were watching here are, in fact, the real videos of the original experiment. It doesn't show all 40 of them, but it shows them administering the shock. And in fact, 40% of them go through with the final experiment. I want to show you one more, someone who doesn't stop, and in fact continues on. Let me go over here. This guy in white, he makes me sad every time I see him.
Let me out of here. Let me out of here.
Continue,
My
please.
heart's bothering me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me
Well, I
out.
mean,
Let me out of here. Let me out. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out. Let me out.
I mean, gee, I don't know.
Well, the experiment requires
Well,
that
I
you
mean,
continue.
I know it does, sir, but I mean, you don't know what he's getting in for. He's up to 195 volts. Answer, please. Wrong. 225 volts. The word is noise. New. House pet book name. Answer, please. Correct. Next one, quiet. Song, party, child, evening. Correct. Next one, tame. Wolf, bear, dog, cat. Wrong. Answer is bear. 240 volts. Next one, sweet.
No, you go back up to the beginning of that page and go through it again until he's learned them all correctly.
Oh, no. No, I'm not going to kill that man. You mean I gotta keep going up with the scale? No, sir. He's already there. I'm not going to give him 450 volts.
The experiment requires that you
I know
continue.
it does, but that man is hollering in there, sir.
As I said before, although the shocks may be painful,
Yeah,
they're not
but
dangerous.
I mean, he's yelling in there.
Start with blue, please, at the top of the page. Continue, please, teacher.
Well, I told him we're going over it again.
No, just go ahead.
Blue, boy, girl, grass, hat. Correct.
I'm just going to talk over him for just a second, and let him play there. You can tell that he's not comfortable with this. I mean, he's hanging his head in his hands. He's standing up, like wringing his hands. He's sort of putting his hands over his head. He's not happy with what he's doing. He's not comfortable with what he's doing. He's not okay with what he's doing. He knows he's doing something wrong. He knows he's hurting someone, and he doesn't want to be doing that. And you'll see if you watch. I strongly recommend you watch the whole video. It's heartbreaking, but he argues with the experimenter. He pleads to the guy, please tell me you're okay. And the guy eventually stops talking, and he's very distressed about it. He's holding his head in his hands. He's very distressed. In fact, this is why they don't hold the Milgram experiment very often anymore. You can't get IRB approval for it. You can't get past the ethics board because it's too distressing on the people, on the subjects of the experiment. I mean, this guy, he's in a lot of distress. So there's just one little clip coming up. I want to just play this for like another minute or two.
The next one is Rich, 330 volts.
Let me out of here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Nice
me out,
one.
I tell you. Let me out. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me here. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out.
Excellent.
Let me out.
Fast.
Let me out. Let me out.
Bird, car, train, plane.
Go on, please, with the procedure.
Please answer. The answer is bird, 345 volts. Blunt, knife, stick, word, arrow. Answer, please.
Go on, teacher.
Here, 375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering on less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please?
Not once we've started. Please continue, teacher.
Cool, day, shade, water, cave. Answer, please. Are you all right in there? Are you all right?
Please
Please continue, teacher.
Well, you know, I keep giving him shocks.
Continue, please.
I'm up to 390.
Continue, please.
Something's happened to that man in there. Nice one, gold, dollar, necklace, moon, paint. Something's happened to that man in there. You better check in on him, sir. He won't answer me or nothing.
Please continue. Go on, please.
You accept all the responsibility?
The responsibility is mine, correct. Please go on.
Gold, dollar, necklace, moon, paint. Answer, please. Are you all right? 405 volts. The answer is moon. An accident.
Yeah. This guy thinks that he's killed this guy. He thinks that there's something medically wrong with this guy, and he keeps going through with the procedure because the experimenter's back there with the lab coat telling him to keep going. And even though he's personally uncomfortable with it, he says, well, you're going to accept responsibility. The experimenter says, yes, I'll accept responsibility. And so the guy keeps going through with it. As long as it's not him personally responsible, as long as it's just him doing what he was ordered to do, then he's able to go far beyond what he is personally comfortable with, right? Far beyond what his own morals would say that he's able to do. Right, so this is the challenge of, this is a big challenge for ethics in the workplace, is that it's really easy to do what you're told, but sometimes what you're told to do is not the right thing to do. And figuring out how to do the right thing, even against what you're told, even against authority, is hard. This guy in the Milgram experiment, he's not an evil guy. He's not, at least that's my impression of him. He's not an evil guy. That he doesn't want to hurt the other guy. Right? He's not trying to hurt people. He's not. He doesn't like hurting people. He doesn't seem like a masochist, or a sadist. He doesn't seem like someone who wants to see other people hurt. He seems, in fact, like he really doesn't like hurting people. He doesn't really want to hurt people. But nevertheless, he's willing to go through with that process. So this is one of the hard things to think about when we're thinking about ethics. It's really easy to think about evil, about the capacity to do great harm, to cause suffering in others. It's really easy to think about this in terms of sort of comic book evil, right? The Mr. Burns, or the malicious, in your tower with the lightning strikes in the background as you're petting your big cat or whatever, right? The comic book evil. The reality is that evil is done by people in normal jobs, by normal people, in normal jobs and normal situations, doing what's expected of them, or maybe even doing a good job of what's expected of them, but operating in a system where these expectations have evil results, have terrible results for humanity. Right? We've talked about the tobacco companies and the gun industry as examples where people might have normal, regular jobs and produce objects that hurt a lot of people. Right? So don't think about evil as just these sort of comic book villains. Think about the evil that happens because normal people fail to think about their world, fail to challenge their expectations, and fail to do the right thing. The difficult upshot of this is that we're all capable of evil, right? That we're all potentially evil. I have a long passage that I think I'm going to hold off on until the hangout from Eichmann in Jerusalem. This is Hannah Arendt talking about the Nazi. I'll just say briefly, Adolf Eichmann was a high-ranking officer in Nazi Germany who was one of the lead architects for the Holocaust, for the prison camps where they murdered millions of Jews. He was the one who designed it. He didn't personally do any of it, right? He didn't point a gun at anyone. He was an office worker. He had a desk job, right? He was filling out reports, right, and signing off on budgets and this kind of stuff, right? But he was doing some of the main work that allowed the Holocaust to operate. After the war, he's caught and sent to Jerusalem, Israel, to be put on trial for crimes against humanity for killing a bunch of people. And Hannah Arendt is a philosopher at Columbia who was asked by, I think, the New Yorker magazine to go to Jerusalem and cover the trial. All right, so she writes And what she writes about, what she calls the banality of evil, this is from the previous slide, banality of evil. She talks about how evil can be executed by normal men, by people who aren't themselves wickedly evil. Right? She says Eichmann was not a evil man. He was maybe a clown, or he was a paper pusher. He was a bureaucrat, but a bureaucrat in the right position can do a lot of evil. And I want to just flag this with some of the discussion in the headlines today. Right? Trump is a very controversial president, and he's been creating a huge amount of backlash. So here are all the rebel Twitter feeds. So Trump put an order saying that all the various departments in his administration can't tweet, especially can't tweet opposition to his policies. And so as a result, a bunch of rogue departments in the government have these alt Twitter accounts where they can tweet separate from the official agency. Right? This is a way of speaking out against what they don't like from the government. In fact, a lot of people in the Trump administration have been resigning or walking out or getting fired because they aren't willing to work with Trump. In the State Department is a monumental thing. This kind of thing doesn't happen. It hasn't happened in living memory, where the whole 4 of the top people in the State Department is the department of the president that interacts with foreign nations, right? So it's sort of diplomatic wing. And State Department, this is where we negotiate treaties, and this is where we make friends in the international community, right? This is global politics, serious stuff. And the top-ranking officials have all quit, have all resigned, or Trump fired them because they weren't willing to toe the Trump line, right? These are people who weren't willing to do what they were told. And these are people who are willing to stand up in opposition. One more example like this. This was last week, I guess. The acting Attorney General Yates was ordered to resign by Trump for failing to, again, toe the Trump party line. And here's her from her 2015 hearings describing how she wouldn't toe the company line. I just want to play the first couple of minutes of this. I think a minute and a half.
Senator Lee asked you about this tax situation where the president, I think I heard him say, just decides that the 35% tax rate's too high. He's going to say we're not going to collect more than 25%. And you said, after pressed a little bit, doesn't sound like something I'd agree with. I'd say that shouldn't take you too long to say, no, this isn't right.
Well, I agree, Senator. I think what I was telling you was that was certainly my gut reaction to it. But if I'm going to be doing battle with anybody, I want to make sure I have the law and the facts and the precedent behind me to be able to give a reasoned judgment. And if I'm in a discussion where people have different views, I want to make sure I've got what I need to back up my views.
Well, you have to watch out because people will be asking you to do things you just need to say no about. Do you think the Attorney General has a responsibility to say no to the president if he asks for something that's improper? A lot of people have defended the Lynch nomination, for example, by saying, well, he appoints somebody who's going to execute his views. What's wrong with that? But if the views the president wants to execute are unlawful, should the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General say no?
Senator, I believe that the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General has an obligation to follow the law and the Constitution and to give their independent legal advice to the president.
Does the Office of Legal Counsel...
Right, so Sally Yates is saying that she has an obligation to give her independent legal advice, even if it means saying no to the president, even if the president wants her to enact an illegal option. Right, so the president says you have to do something illegal. Do you follow what the president says and do the illegal thing? Or do you stay independent and say no to the president? Saying no to the president is very hard. The president's the most powerful man in the world, right? How do you say no to the president? On the other hand, there's this legality constitutionality, morality, right? Can you say no to the president? Sally Yates, in her confirmation hearing, says that she feels that she has an obligation to say no to the president. And just recently, just last week, Trump fired her for refusing to enforce a legal order designed to protect citizens of the United States. Right, so she refused to sign off on the Muslim ban, and she was fired as a result. Right, so these are examples right from the headlines, right from this week's headlines, of people taking a moral stance and refusing to do what they're told. Right, recognizing that there's more important things than just following your orders. I hope that gives you some introduction to the this week's lessons. The last thing on the list, and we'll probably talk about this also on Tuesday, is the first follower video. This whole lesson we've been talking about why conformity and obedience can be problematic, especially in a corporate environment. But it's also important to remember why obedience and conformity is central to how human social systems organize. So think about these. These are complex, difficult, these are very serious topics. But I hope that introduces you to the week's lesson, and I'll see you on Tuesday. Thanks, everyone.